Nothing in this podcast or on our website should be construed as medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider for your individual nutritional and medical needs. The information presented is based on our research and is strictly that of the author and not necessarily those of any professional group or other individual.
Hi, I'm Sue Becker from Bread Beckers. Welcome to Sue's Healthy Minutes. I'm so excited you've joined me today, and I hope this episode encourages you and allows you to find the answers you have been praying for the health of you and your family. Today, on Sue's Healthy Minutes, I would like to focus on some practical tips of bread making and hopefully answer some frequently asked questions. I recently had the great pleasure of speaking at a conference in Memphis, Tennessee. I was handed a list of questions submitted by those in attendance, and most were questions specifically about making bread with freshly milled flour. In my podcast episodes, I tend to focus more on the nutritional benefits of milling your own grains and not so much on the actual baking process. Of course, in my cooking and baking demonstrations, I do, but I often do not address some of the specific, very practical questions people have. So today, I decided to take that list of questions I was given and try to answer each one of them, assuming that they may be questions you all have as well. First question, does my mill stay out on my counter, and do I mill my flour every time I want to bake something? The answer is yes, absolutely. When my children were all at home, I used my mill every day and sometimes several times a day. I mill my flour right when I'm ready to use it. With 7 children at home at the time, I was always making something. I typically made about 6 loaves of yeasted bread twice a week, but on any given day, I was additionally making muffins, pancakes, coffee cake, occasionally cookies, brownies, or some other type of dessert. I also use my freshly milled flour to thicken gravies or to coat fried chicken or country fried steak. So having my mill always easily accessible was more advantageous for me. Now that my children are all grown and Brad and I are empty nesters, I do not need to bake quite as often, but my mill still sits out on my counter as I still use it almost daily for muffins, pancakes, biscuits, bread, and rolls. I'm just not making as much at one time as I used to for our large family. And even though I have a very small kitchen, my mill still sits on my counter. It's used way too often to store away. Second question, what is the yield of flour from grain once milled? Ounce for ounce, pound for pound, gram for gram, it will be the same. So 1 pound of flour will give you 1 pound of grain. The weight does not change. Not so with volume measurements. When you mill your grain into flour, you increase the volume. Typically, over all these years of milling, I have found that for most grains, especially hard wheat, after milling, the yield is about half again as much flour as grain. For example, 2/3 cup of grain yields about 1 cup of flour. 1 cup of grain yields about 1.5 cups of flour. 1 1/3 cups of grain yields about 2 cups of flour, and 2 cups of grain yields about 3 cups of flour, and so on and so on. Now, grains such as soft wheat, spelt, and rye will yield slightly more due to their higher moisture content. They mill up a little fluffier than other grains. But I still use this basic conversion when determining how much grain to mill for the flour called for in my recipe. Now, this brings me to the third question of converting traditional recipes to freshly milled flour and tricks to make it successful. I first want to discuss weighing versus measuring your ingredients. It has become very trendy in the past few years to weigh ingredients for baking instead of measuring using cups. And I will be the first to admit it is much easier to convert a processed flour recipe to freshly milled if the original recipe is written in weights. You simply use the same weight as called for in the recipe, and you should get fairly consistent results. But I have been cooking and baking for more than 60 years now. I learned to cook and bake with standard liquid and dry measuring cups. For years, that is the way recipes were written. I have now been baking with freshly milled flour for more than 34 years. So all of the traditional recipes and family favorites that I used before milling were all written using volume measurements such as cups, not weights. And I would imagine the same will be for you. So that is the way I measure and have for all these years. There are huge variables with yeast bread, and many older yeast bread recipes using commercial white flour typically gave a range of the amount of flour needed, usually a variable of about a half a cup of flour. So the recipe might say 4 to 4.5 cups of flour. With freshly milled flour, the variables are even greater. Not only the humidity in the air on your bake day, but also the protein and moisture content of the type of grain you are using. Where the wheat is grown and the variety can affect the protein content in the wheat. And this protein content can vary from year to year and even shipment to shipment, bucket to bucket. But I have found the general rule of thumb when using hard wheat, such as in yeast breads, you will typically use about the same amount of freshly milled flour as commercial flour called for in your recipe. Most of you are probably, like me, using a mixer or a bread machine of some kind for kneading your yeast bread. When using a mixer, I let the mixer determine how much flour to use. Mixers with dough hooks usually suggest to add flour until the dough begins to pull away from the sides of the bowl. With my Ankish room, again, I let it tell me how much flour to use by watching what the dough looks like as I add the flour. I adjust the arm as needed, and when I get close to the amount called for in the recipe, I pull the arm into the center, holding it there just briefly to see if the dough immediately pulls away from the sides of the bowl. If it does, I know that I've added enough flour. If it doesn't pull away, I add more flour a little at a time, checking again after each addition to see if the dough pulls away with the roller into the center of the bowl. We have demonstration videos on our Bread Becker's YouTube channel if you need a visual for this. It certainly helps to see it in action. Once I have determined if I've added enough flour, I then allow the dough to knead until it looks smooth and is elastic, stretchy. The biggest mistake I think people make with yeast bread is adding too much flour. Freshly milled flour is thirsty, and as it kneads, the fiber in the bran and the germ will absorb some of that moisture. So dough made with freshly milled flour will look much wetter at first. But if you will just let your dough be a little wetter looking and softer using slightly less flour, your dough will be softer and stay soft longer. Let's face it, most all bread is delicious right out of the oven and cooled a bit if you can wait that long, and especially slathered with some good butter. But if your bread is dry and crumbly the day or so after baking, try using just a little less flour. Also, I know many bakers talk about adjusting the liquids in a recipe when baking with certain grains, but I have always found it much easier to just adjust the amount of flour used than messing with the liquids. When I use a bread machine, I may have a trial run checking the dough as it is kneading to determine how much flour is needed for that batch of wheat. I open the lid about 10 minutes into my 20 minutes kneading cycle to see what the dough looks like. If too wet, I add a little flour. If too stiff, I add a tablespoon or so of water. Once I determine the amount for that bucket or variety of wheat, I stick with that amount. Remember, recipes are just suggestions. You may decide you want to reduce the honey called for or not add the egg. This will affect the amount of flour you need as you have reduced the liquids. But these changes are easy to make once you get used to what your dough should look like. In non-yeast leavened bread, such as cakes, cookies, pancakes, muffins, or biscuits, most any wheat or grain can be used. But soft wheat, or known as pastry flour, or a low-protein wheat such as einkorn, spelt, or even rye and barley, will lend a softer and more moist texture to your finished product. If the white flour recipe you are wanting to convert is written in weight measurements, then simply use the same weight of soft wheat or whatever grain you choose to use. But if the recipe is written in cups, I find the general rule of conversion is to increase the freshly milled soft wheat flour used by a quarter cup for every cup of white flour called for in the recipe. For example, if your cake or cookie recipe calls for 1 cup of white flour, you will use 1¼ cups of freshly milled soft wheat flour. If your recipe calls for 2 cups, then you're going to use 2½ cups of freshly milled soft wheat flour. If your recipe calls for 3 cups of white flour, then you're going to use 3¾ cup of freshly milled soft wheat flour, and so on. Again, I will admit it is much easier to convert a white flour recipe by using weight measurements, but in reality, most of our traditional recipes we may want to convert are most probably going to be written using the traditional cup measurements. So hopefully these tips will help you in converting those family favorites. I know there are those who are adamant about weighing your ingredients instead of measuring, insisting that you will get more consistent results. And on a large scale, such as a commercial bakery, this can certainly be true. But a main reason commercial bakeries weigh their ingredients is simply a practical one. To weigh out a large quantity of flour is much faster than measuring out hundreds of cups. And if you are a female and remotely as old as I am, you had to take home economics classes in school. Then, like me, you were taught how to correctly measure your cups of flour. We were taught to lightly spoon the flour into the dry measuring cup, then level off the excess by scraping a knife across the top of the measuring cup. Well, I recently tested the accuracy of this way of measuring by weighing several cups of freshly milled flour I had measured using this correct method. I did indeed find a discrepancy in the weight of the cups of flour that I had measured out correctly. The difference was as little as 1 to 2 grams, but as much as 11 grams. But when I measured even this larger difference of 11 grams, it was less than 1 tablespoon. So the 1 to 2 grams difference would certainly be a minute difference in volume. Multiplied by 100 or 200, as in a commercial setting, this might make a difference in the finished product. But for most of us baking at home, using a single or double, maybe even a triple recipe, 1 tablespoon of flour difference is probably going to be negligible and will not adversely affect the outcome of your muffin, bread, or any other baked item. One other consideration when measuring your flour by cups, I mentioned the correct method of measuring earlier. With freshly milled flour, the flour is very aerated, so I find that I can simply scoop up the flour with my measuring cup and slightly shake it or scrape it with a knife to level. If I do by chance store the flour and let it settle, then I do need to measure by spooning the flour into the cup first, then level by scraping a knife across the top. I just want to encourage each of you to use whatever method of measuring you find works best for you and that you feel most comfortable with, and whatever recipe suits the taste and preference of your family. I know I tweaked my basic bread recipe several times over the years to get it where I liked the outcome the best. One last point on converting a recipe. Remember, commercially processed all-purpose flour is just that. It is all-purpose. It makes good yeast bread as well as cakes, cookies, or biscuits. So, what type of wheat you use when converting an all-purpose flour recipe to freshly milled flour will completely depend on whether it is a yeast leavened bread, or a non-yeast bread recipe. If yeast bread, you will need to use a high-protein hard wheat as the predominant grain for your flour. Rainfall during the growing season greatly affects the protein content in wheat. Growers and grain elevators will usually test their harvest for protein content. It is declared as a percentage protein. The protein content for a good hard wheat for bread making can range from 12 to 14%. The higher the percentage, the better the gluten formation, the better elasticity in your dough, giving you a better rise and texture to your bread. So, in a recipe that calls for AP flour or all-purpose flour, if it's a yeast bread, you want to use a hard wheat. If it's not yeast, you can pretty much use any grain you want, but soft wheat, spelt, or einkorn will give the best texture to your muffin, pancakes, your cakes, your cookies, your biscuits, or pie dough. That brings me to the fourth question I was asked to explain. What is meant by hydration in bread dough? Do recipes need more freshly milled flour or less? And what is autolyse? And will it help strengthen the gluten structure? Well, hydration and autolyse are terms that have definitely become more common with the popularity of sourdough baking. Hydration is simply the flour to water ratio used in a recipe and is stated as a percentage. For example, a 1-to-1 ratio of flour to water would be 100% hydration. A 2-to-1 ratio of flour to water would be a 50% hydration. Percent hydration is typically used in sourdough bread making and bread recipes that do not use any oil or sweetener, but simply use flour, water, salt, and yeast or sourdough starter. I have heard many sourdough bakers complain that they make beautiful, fluffy sourdough loaves out of commercially processed white flour, but since switching to freshly milled flour, their loaves are dense and heavy. Is it any wonder that everyone loved the new white flour that became readily available in the early 1900s as they favored the fluffy, light loaves that they could now produce? Freshly milled flour is thirsty. The bran and germ present in freshly milled flour soak up water like a sponge. So for bakers that use a hydration formula, I find that freshly milled flour needs more water. So in these recipes, a 90 to 100% hydration works best. Autolyse is another bread making term that has become more commonly used since sourdough became popular. Autolyse is a simple technique used when making yeast or sourdough breads to strengthen the gluten structure. Gluten is nothing more than the stretchy substance that forms when wheat flour is mixed with water. It forms when the unique proteins, gliadin and glutenine, found in wheat flour are fully hydrated. By briefly mixing only the flour and water just until combined, and then letting the dough rest for 20 minutes or so before adding any other ingredients, particularly any oil or fat, will allow the flour to fully hydrate, which enhances the gluten formation. This greatly improves the strength of the dough and is especially helpful in lower protein wheat varieties or grains used. This is the method used in the popular no-knead or overnight bread recipes. Recipes that only use flour, water, salt, and a very small amount of yeast can simply be stirred, covered, and allowed to rest for 8 to 10 hours. The gluten will be fully developed with no kneading, and the loaf, after just a gentle shaping, is ready to bake in a hot oven in a covered cloche or Dutch oven. The sponge method is very similar to an autolyse, but is typically used for recipes calling for oil, honey, or other sweeteners or eggs. In this method, you combine half the flour with all the water and the yeast. You mix just until combined to form a soft batter. Allow to rest for 20 to 30 minutes or until the yeast is bubbly. Then you add the remaining ingredients and knead as usual. This sponging of the dough, like with an autolyse, encourages hydration of the flour and therefore gluten formation before you add the oil and the honey and the sweeteners. But it also contributes to the flavor of the bread. A fifth question I was asked was about how many loaves can you get out of one of Bread Becker's 6-gallon buckets of grain? And along with that question, for people ordering on the co-op, how can you figure out how much wheat to buy for the 4-month co-op ordering cycle? For all of our wheat buckets, there is 42 pounds in a 6-gallon bucket. For my basic bread dough that makes a 2-pound loaf or 2 1-pound loaves, you use approximately 1.5 pounds of wheat. So, in 42 pounds, you will be able to make 28 recipes. That's 28 2-pound loaves or 56 1-pound loaves. This would be just for your basic bread. This would not include what you would use for muffins, pancakes, or other baking. For our family, when we first started and the older 7 children were all at home, making us a family of 9, we averaged about 1 bucket of wheat per month. Of course, if you're using a mixture of red and white wheat and ordering a bucket of each, then that would be about 2 months. Though I wasn't asked this question at the recent conference, I often get asked about the cost of investment and if the bread is economical in the long run. The investment to begin this journey is certainly significant, but in the long run, the money saved on groceries, healthcare, and medications can be tremendous. I did some cost comparisons some years ago, and the reduction in our grocery bill alone was very noticeable. While the price of ready-made breads and flour products offered in the grocery store might be less expensive, they will not satisfy or fill you up, and especially not a growing child or a teenager. You will find that you will actually spend more trying to feed your family on these ready-made commercial products than the bread and baked goods you will now make with freshly milled flour. We found that our grocery bill significantly decreased. I hope you enjoyed some of these practical tips for milling your own grain and making your own bread, and hopefully I've answered a few of your questions as well. And I will continue to say that the most valuable appliance that still sits on my kitchen counter today is my grain mill, and that it is worthy of its space, even in my tiny little kitchen. Until next time, this is Sue Becker from Bread Beckers with Sue's Healthy Minutes.
Sue's Healthy Minutes podcast has been a presentation by the Bread Beckers Incorporated located in Woodstock, Georgia. For more information, store hours, and learning opportunities, visit breadbeckers.com and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Share this with 2 friends who would benefit from this information, and be sure to join us again next week for more of Sue's Healthy Minutes.